I have the great pleasure of introducing the author.
Don't do that.
He says, please don't do that. Obviously, that's why I did it. Laurent de Sutter, who is a professor of legal theory at the Free University in Brussels, and who analyzes contemporary phenomena through legal history and legal philosophy. And this is, I think, precisely what he is going to do today. If I wanted to list his books, this would take another a very long time, which is why I've chosen certain examples of his books. One of them is Narco-Capitalism, which I think he had a lot of success with a little bit different title in the original French. So Narco-Capitalism. Then another book that I think was also very important to me personally. I mentioned it today already in the talk, Pour en finir avec soi-même, to get rid of yourself. The English does not yet exist, unfortunately, but you can get the book in Slovenian already. So this is, this is how important Slovenian language actually is. This is all I wanted to say. It's a wonderful book. I honestly recommend it. Then a very interesting book which directly discusses law, called After Law, obviously a play on Kafka. And his most recent production, Super Faible, Super Weak, which stands out from the majority of his books, also on account of being a pretty thick book. Like it seems like a decent book that Laurent has written. All of his works are a pleasure to read. This is the author that I can honestly, wholeheartedly condone and endorse. And I'm really looking forward to his Super Faible book. And that's all I'm going to say. Laurent, it's a pleasure to have you back in Ljubljana. And please, tell us more.
Wow. Thank you, Gregor. I'm embarrassed now. I'm going to blush, but out of satisfaction. I'm so happy to be back in Ljubljana, indeed. Not only because it is this utopia that Helen spoke about earlier, but because this is a place where precisely you can see in exercise or in practice what true friendship is, which means the power to embarrass you. So this is something I'm always very happy to feel. I've had to ponder a little bit about what I would tell you today, because obviously alienation was already, as a matter of fact, a topic of the last invitation that I got from Gregor a few months ago for precisely the release of the Slovenian translation of How to Get Rid with Yourself. So the lazy me, which is a big part of me, was inclined to say, okay, I would simply serve the cold dish and do that again. And then I said, no, a little bit of respect. So I had to come up with something new, which I'm not very good at. I prefer to rehash all things, but whatever. So I've decided to try and talk to you about something that looms in the background of the discussion on alienation, or looms in the background on the language, let's say, of alienation. It has been said already several times before. The general context of a conversation about alienation implies Marx, implies Hegel, implies the whole critical tradition from the mid-19th century up to the present day, and implies also a discussion about who we are, a place in society, how society deals with all this capitalism, and so on and so forth. But is it all that there is to it? Or is there not, behind this word, something that forces us to have a look, or a deeper look, to a history or to a tradition that goes to the very roots of our language? And obviously the answer to that question is yes, or is yes for me, since it's my little business to try and do these little investigations into what is part of what Roland Barthes called the fascism of language, the fact that language is never simply about information that we convey. It's simply about, you know, communication, emotions, and so on and so forth. But we are, let's say, we are like Muppets that are talked through language, but talked through in a very specific manner, in a manner close to what Alenka Spancic, in a book, Let Them Rot, a book on Antigone precisely, spoke as the surplus reel of language. There's always something that is sold to us in language, and that we're not sure that we desire. We are not even sure that we know it, but it's there, and it's indeed looming in the background. So it's this background that I'm going to try and scratch a little bit for you through a series of little inquiries into the source, let's say, the sources of alienation as we know it. And I mentioned the fact that you know, I mentioned this idea that Roland Barthes had of the fascism of language. I could have mentioned, of course, George Agamben's famous theory of the sacrament of language, the fact that language is ingrained into something which is never simply about a description of the world, but about some sort of an ought to be that always goes along with a description of the world, the fact that language is always already about command and not simply about, let's say, an objective, more or less objective view of the world. This would say that, indeed, when we open our mouth and we are using words such as the word alienation, what comes to the fore is power, force, and to a certain extent, and here to a very precise extent, law. So I'm going to talk about law. It's even more, it's even easier for me because, you know, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a lawyer. So it's a way to try and capture, let's say, the conversation and bring it back into some familiar territories for me. It's a famous trope, or almost a cliche these days, to say that, okay, Marx, alienation, but it's a concept that comes from Roman law. It comes from the idea that alienation concerns property or ownership. It's an ownership that is transferred from one person to another. That is what alienation is, or should be, or might be in Roman law. It's at the same time true and not true. It is true because indeed there is alienatio among the different, in the vocabulary of the Roman lawyers. If you open the Institutes of Gaius, this manual, the only manual of law that we have of the Roman times, it's a book that has been written around 161 of our common era. When you open the Institutes of Gaius, indeed you see the word alienatio appear, but it doesn't appear as something that is technical. It describes, let's say, a general state of affair of, indeed, transmission of property. When the Romans were discussing ownership transfer, they would rather use very technical terms such as mancipatio, which is the literal transfer from one hand to another of a thing, or in, let's say, more minor cases, the vocabulary of the in iure caesio, which is a kind of forced trial in which one person is condemned to give back to another something that he actually never possessed. So if we want to be technical about the question of alienation or the question of alienatio, at least if we take this cliche about the Roman origin of alienation seriously, we have to dig a little bit deeper. And we have to dig in, and I will just give two little sentences. I'm sorry to bother you with technicalities. Lawyers are very good with boring people with technicalities. So I'm doing this thing to try and impersonate, let's say, my status. So these two quotes in Latin, obviously, by Gaius, one from the Institute, so sequitur de iure personarum alia divisio nam quaedam personae seu iuris sunt quaedam alieno iuris sunt subjectae, which is the first affirmation of a division that exists within Roman law between personae sui iuris sunt, the persons who are sui iuris, and quaedam alieno iuris sunt subjectae, those who are the subject of the law of another, alieni iuris. This mention, this division, which is absolutely fundamental for Gaius, because it describes two regimes of persons and then to regimes of rights and the extension of the rights that one has and the other has not, has become a classic, and it has been, let's say, officialized a few centuries afterwards, in the 5th century of the present era, when Justinian codified the totality of Roman law into, let's say, one big set of texts, the Corpus Juris Civilis. Among these texts, there was also a text called Institutes, and in the Institutes of Justinian, you see this divide between Alieni Iuris and Seu Iuris being actually implemented. So often, the distinction between the two is simply translated by autonomous versus heteronymous. There are those who are autonomous, meaning that they can decide their own fate from the point of view of law, and those who cannot. Those who can, it's quite easy. These are the citizens, the male citizens, and not all male citizens, the male citizens who have the ownership of their patrimonium, namely the pater familias. All the others were alieni iuris. They were alienated, if you'd like, of any form of complete right of ownership and all the let's say, rights that go with the idea of ownership. So, you know that this goes very far in Roman law. The one who is a sui iuris, the one who exerts his own right, or the one who says, let's say, the law, or is the incarnation of the law in a certain context, can go very far in the exercise of this power, because ultimately, and even though it has been reformed slightly in the during the first centuries of the present era, but roughly the power that the sui iuris has is a power called vita nequisque potestas, which is the power of life and death, the power to destroy everything and everybody that is under his custody. And I say his custody because, again, it's only male citizens and so on and so forth. So the difference between the sui iuris and the alieni iuris is that the one who is alieni iuris, who is under the law of somebody else, who doesn't have the totality, the possible total enjoyment of his or her own rights, can be destroyed by somebody else. It's literally under the domination of somebody else. So it means heteronymous is not about translation. It means literally it's the law of another that applies to you. Okay, you don't have any proper law, if you'd like. You are not independent from the law of others, but you are under the dependence of the law of someone else. The question of independence, autonomy, independence, dependence, heteronomy is very important. I will come back to that a little bit later. What we can infer from this already, and which belongs to the history of the Latin language, is that when we speak of alieni iuris, the alienus is the one that is not something. He is the one, or she is the one, that is compared to, or can be compared to, the person who has, let's say, the full enjoyment of his rights. So alienus in Roman law, and not only Roman law, in Roman language, is always a comparative. It's between two regimes of law in this case, but it's also between two types of person. It's not simply a quality that is yours, but it's a quality that exists only insofar as it is in relationship with the quality of somebody else. So it's a comparative. And all the uses of alienus, not only in law, but in general in Latin, are based on this idea of comparison. What is alien, if you say, is what can be compared to what is not alien. So I said this was new, so it literally is something that I've not rehearsed, right? Okay. All right. What's important is this idea of comparison and this idea of alienation through legal dispositive and through the difference of rights and the difference of status is that the fact that you are not yourself as alienated, as an alieni Iuris. You are not you're yourself in your rights only insofar as they are the rights of somebody else somewhere that can be exerted upon you, means that, of course, there's a difference not only of status between the two, but also that there's some kind of a difference almost of world between the two. It's not exactly the same world that the Sui Iuris lives in and the Alieni Iuris lives in. These worlds are different. There's some kind of an estrangement, if you'd like, or a dimension of foreignness between the two. And indeed, besides the idea of comparison, the idea of alienus also implies in Latin or in Roman language something that a series of nuance about the idea of the foreigner, the person who comes from afar, the person who is not part of the world that is yours. And what the law does here is indeed to try and suture through this division this difference between two worlds in order for these two worlds to somehow connect and to somehow work. It's in a way, if you'd like, to bridge the gap between worlds that otherwise would remain and would insist. So the alien, in that case, the alienus, the stranger, or the strange foreigner that the alien is, the alienus is indeed that which the law recognizes to be compatible with the Sus, the one who has his own rights, despite the difference of the world. And it means that the alien is also that which the law organizes the compatibility with the Sus, which means that from the point of view of law, this autonomy of the Sus is, if you'd like, a little bit of the same as the heteronomy of the alienus, because both of them have to be articulated to have a meaning, which means, of course, that the Sus is Sus only because there is he is, let's say, also an alienus, but from the point of view of law itself. So there's, let's say, a third actor above the division between Sus and alienus that alienates both into its own domination or its own power, which is the power that law has in order to both make the division and then suture the division afterwards. So there is no Sus per se. There are two different types of alieni, if you'd like. There is the Sus alienus and then the alienus alienus. Now, this is important because it may have effect, and it has had effect, and concrete effect in the history of Rome. And I would like to just to very briefly mention here the date 212, which was the date of the proclamation of the what is called as the Edict of Antonius, so the Constitutio Antoniana, which is a text that, for the first time in the history of Rome, tried to, that's how it is presented often, tried to repair something that was considered a problem. And what was considered a problem is simply the fact that there was such a huge division of status between the people under the domination of Rome. Of course, there were the citizens, and inside the citizens there is this distinction that I mentioned, Sui Iuris, Alieni Iuris, then there are different types of citizens, there were the slaves, but then there was also 80 to 90% of the population of the Roman Empire that was not concerned at all with that. And those were called, there were different subdivisions, but the most important group in this 80-90% of the Roman population was called the Peregrini, which were simply persons who were free, but who were not entitled the same rights as the citizens of Rome. They were not also in the same, let's say, tax situation, because they had to pay different taxes that the Roman citizens didn't have to pay, and so on and so forth. But most importantly, they were ruled by another law, that the law organizing the division between Sui and Alieni Iuris. They were organized according, or they were concerned according to domain of Roman law that was called the Ius Gentium, the law of people. by opposition of the jus civile, the use of the city, the use of Rome that applies to Roman citizens. In 212, the emperor decided that it was time to finish with that, and he granted Roman citizenship to everyone. So this immense mass of people who were left out, let's say, of Roman citizenship suddenly became citizens. And in the history, you know, in the historiography, it's often presented as an act of generosity, even if some people have said that perhaps there were some tax issue behind, but it's discussed, it's controversial. It's often presented as, you know, an act of creating some sort of an equality. But when you look at it from a different perspective, you can also see it as a terrible moment, a moment of erasure of another possibility than living under the domination of the jus civile, which was precisely the fact that the existence of the jus gentium made the peregrini a part. They had the possibility to decide upon their own religion. Rome was not interested. They had the possibility to decide about how they would deal about their own relationship and so on and so forth. They were somehow a little bit free to do, I wouldn't say whatever they want, but you know, they had a more, let's say, they had more space to breathe than once they are turned into Roman citizens. So the idea of the alien there, the one who is not part of the world, the way the world expels away someone, suddenly becomes turns to be is made worse, if you like, by an attempt at integrating and putting some kind of an equality. So getting rid, let's say, of the super alienation that the foreigner, the absolute foreigner that the peregrini is, or the more or less absolute foreigner that it is, suddenly is erased. So, if you follow me here, both when we speak about let's say Roman, the basic distinctions of Roman law, when we speak about this type of management of citizenship within Roman Empire, and we see how the vocabulary of the alien, the alienus, and alienation serves a certain purpose, then you realize that indeed, contrarily perhaps to what our intuition says, that alienation precisely doesn't mean separation or distancing. It doesn't mean, if you like, being expelled from oneself. It does mean, being put into the dependency or under the dependency of somebody else. Or alienation, if you'd like, and can be seen as the condition of possibility of a world in which there is more than one. There's always somebody else somewhere that has power, let's say, upon you. And this idea, let's say, of a world with more than one, that alienation implies, might become even clearer if we make a little, a short stop with some friends, or not so friends, depending on the period of the Romans, namely the Greeks. When you see, I know that it's very complex and to justify the jump from alienus to xenos is well, it's complicated, but let's say that for the sake of the exercise, that they have something to say to each other, or that is not exactly the equivalent, but that there can be a dialogue, a semantic dialogue between the two categories. Because normally the translation of alienus would be heteros in Greek, but let's say that if you take seriously the alien in the alienus, the alien in the alienation, then indeed it's xenos that should be here used. And xenos, again, we know it's a stranger, it's a foreigner, but here again, it's more than that. It's also some kind of a relationship, not necessarily a comparison anymore, but some kind of a relationship. And this relationship is the relationship that exists between someone who is there and someone who arrives. It's the relationship that has been, that has received the name of hospitality, if you'd like, in our languages. And this relationship, again, is due because of reasons of place, or reasons of world, if you'd like. It's because you're not of the place that I owe you hospitality. It's an hospitality that is due to the one who has no right to the place. And who has no right to the place for a very simple reason, is that the xenos, the one who comes from afar, is not simply a stranger, but is also dangerous. Hospitality, hostis, is the hostility, is the enemy that you allow in your own house, and with whom you decide to remain in good terms for a moment. So it means that xenia, which is the name of precisely the ceremony of welcoming, let's say, the xenos, it's the equivalent, it's the hospitality, if you like, that you know to a xenos, that you owe to a xenos. It's a right which is due to this person who is your enemy, whom you should kill, and who lives in your place where you are the master. But the fact that you are the master precisely implies that you have to give the xenos this right to be there and to be welcome. It's precisely because of that that hospitality is decisive. So the xenos is the one who has to be welcomed as the unwelcome. So it's a pact, if you like. It's again a juridical accord, a juridical deal, an agreement, not only that you do with the xenos, but that you do with yourself, and that the society, let's say, or the law forces you also to do. So again, when we speak about aliens, alienus, alieni, xenoi, alienation, it's not simply about, again, an ontological dimension of our being that is at stake, or it's not simply the status of the worker, or it's not simply, it's not already not that simple, but it's not simply, let's say, a political context, but it's literally a cosmological issue, if you like. It's a question of space, and the space of exchange, and the space of exchange of terms about our dependencies. Dependencies which imply, indeed, some sort of domination at some point. But here, with the xenia, with the hospitality due to the xenos, alienation, if you'd like, is what gives an advantage to the dependent upon the one who is not dependent. So the question, in order to just wrap this little inquiry up, so the question, if you take it from there, if you take it from this rapid sketch of legal history, the question of alienation turns out to be not something that requires from us a solution of some sort. You know, we are alienated, now we have to stop being alienated, or on the contrary, shall we continue to be alienated, and so on and so forth. It's not, you know, it's not a Byul-Chung Han type of problem where you can just put, you know, some kind of trump cards on the table and say, okay, that's solved. The problem is, yeah, I know, I can't stand the guy. It's more about a question addressed to the problem of dependency and the problem of independence. Do we really need, and these examples that I've given here are simply illustrations out of Roman law, but if we think about contemporary institutions, or if you think about our contemporary predicament, if you'd like, even from the point of view of, let's say, environment, ecology, and so on and so forth, the question of alienation, because it asks the question of dependency, asks also the political question, which is for me decisive, more decisive than to know if we are to get free of alienation whatsoever, which is, what type of dependency do we want? What form of dependency do we need? What type of structure of dependence are we to design? And the Romans had one interpretation of that. I believe that, speaking of alienation today, precisely implies, for us, politically at least, to tackle this issue of the type of dependency within which we are ready to live. There are dependencies that are killing us, but there are dependencies also that make us live. And perhaps this is something also that Gregor hinted at a little bit earlier. It's indeed the outside that decides what we are in the inside, if you'd like. You know, we are just nothing, basically, but a nothing that echoes the nothingness of others in such a way that indeed it becomes, or we become something, or something like that. So what kind of dependency do we need? What kind of dependency do we want? What I would need to suggest here is that at least Roman law points us towards this dimension, and not simply the dimension of being expelled from something, losing something. Actually, by losing something, we also gain something, which is precisely this dimension of dependency. So I wanted just to add the idea of dependency on the table of this very nice and very beautiful conference, for which I thank again all the organizers for organizing them, and Gregor, of course, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for giving us this wonderful perspective, taking us away from the spontaneous philosophical, metaphysical, ontological thoughts on human existence and so on, into very practical legal matters. I did think that was really important. The idea you mentioned here in the end was very much to my liking, the idea that the outside defines what we are on the inside. I think this is something that pertains to the question of alienation, but also authenticity very closely. And if I'm allowed to ask, you know, the first question should be mine, maybe. I'm using the jus petris, and just do it, which is the institution of xenia, of this guest friendship. My references are of course not from the law. My references are from Greek literature, from tragedies and so on. But still, I find it really interesting, specifically because in a way it illustrates the idea of accepting a foreigner, a foreign subject, into your home, into your own space, and having to do that as a sort of, you know, one of the primordial aspects of what a civilized life is. Like, you know, if you want to see where humans get from the state of nature to the state of law, to the civil state, I suppose it's precisely when you are able to, you know, accept a stranger as part of, you know, for a certain time, you are part of my home in a way. And, you know, you can extend this logic onto language itself in a sense, you know, but also all kinds of institutions that we actually have. But this is perhaps a bit too general, so I'm not sure if you're able to respond.
I think that yes, it makes me think of it made me think of something, which is the fact that of two things to be precise. One, it's totally anecdotal, but it's the fact that you know, the fiction state of nature, civil state, we know that it has never existed, but we know that there was something that could be that served as xenia before xenia, which was heavy drinking. And this is what some archaeologists and historians these days have shown is the famous beer before bread hypothesis. You know, in the development of human society, because alcohol inhibits, you know, the let's say the frontal frontal cortex, which is the siege, let's say the place where our rationalists, aggressive, its selfish impulses are, apparently, according to those guys. So thank you, heavy drinking, for paving the way to hospitality. More substantially, perhaps. So on this issue of alienation and strangeness or xenos, alien. You know that because I think we're basically on the same page on that, and I spoke about it the last time. But the ones who these days are, for me at least, are speaking of alienation in the most interesting way are the xenofeminists, precisely because their motto is very clear: we are not alienated enough. We need more alienation. Why? But because the alien is us. You know? And it's not something that we are deprived of. On the contrary, there are so many things that are put into us, and in the case of the xenofeminists, of course, it's into the body of women that are put, let's say, in a way that it's undesired, unchecked, and so on and so forth, that I want to take back my alienation and alienate myself more, but in the direction that I'm interested in. And this is, let's say, a parallel that I'm trying to make here with the question of dependency. It goes in the same, let's say, it goes in the same direction. So more alienation, please. If I may, coin a Slovenian title, if you'd like, that would be also the, let's say, something that also looms in the background, but of my own concerns here.
Absolutely. So, okay, we have already many questions. So Nadezhda?
But do we have a choice to ask for more alienation if it's about dependency and the others?
It's yeah, that's a good one. I suppose we do. I suppose we do. I don't know to what extent, but I suppose we do.
Okay, so Alexander.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful lectures. I was actually looking forward to it. Basically, when it comes to drinking, I was remembering that, Marx's first
text... It's aperitif time,
huh?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to be short once again. So basically, so we can all drink afterwards. Marx's first text was on the theft of wood on Rhineland wine growers, and so that made me think, to what extent was this I actually do have a question. So, to what extent was this unique to Rome? And did this distinction kind of, how do you say, get articulated in different ways in post-Roman countries? I don't know, like the Holy Roman Empire afterwards, or so is there any heritage to this, and how did it play out with property relations? Because obviously alienation, according to your thesis, came out of property. That's basically the basic thesis. And also, just by pure coincidence, like a text for text I was writing, I actually saw that in France, this kind of distinction was all active all the way up until the French Revolution and even afterwards. So you have this distinction between the active and the passive citizens. Actually, I don't know if you can maybe comment on this a little bit more, because the active citizens were male over 25 who had some sort of small property and could vote. So this was still vivid and still active after the French Revolution, and I'm not sure where it ended up and when it was abolished, but I guess some heritage of that must have been kept alive in the legal system in France, if it was still visible all the way after the French Revolution. Thanks.
Well, thank you for all that. Yes, of course it has. We still, most of us, at least in continental Europe, but also in every country where Europe has somehow colonized and exerts its colonial power, Roman law is still the basic. These are the basic categories of our daily life. We are still from the point of view of law. We are basically Romans. With some strange specificities, it has changed, but the basic bricks and the basic logic remains the same. So yes, it's still there, and that's why I spoke about it. I spoke about it because indeed, what resounds in these old institutions, it's still also part of our vocabulary, and we can, but let's say that if we put that aside, at least let's do it while knowing what we do, right? So yeah, that's very true. That it's still there. It's still some kind of a ghost, but a ghost that materializes in very concrete institutions. And as for the question of ownership and property, that was a big takeover in the 17th century upon law of the ideology of liberalism, which was a transformation of the ancient understanding of what a property was. The Romans were obsessed. The law was invented. The Roman law, at least, or Roman law was created for property. It was not created for people. I mean, it was about how we make so that things circulate. So we need some kind of people for things to circulate. So we will invent subjects of rights, for instance, subject of law, and so on. So that goods can circulate between people and can circulate also between generations. So that's what's their big obsession, and all the inventions that they will do, including adoption and others, have been created only in that respect, so that goods could circulate. In the 17th century, there's this kind of shift between one sense of property, which is simply material property, into something that is directly linked with labor and a certain understanding of labor as the labor to the great glory of God, so to speak. So it's the mystics of ownership and the mystics of property, took over, and there also it implied a series of decisions, and it was very clear in Locke, but not only in Locke, in all the political writers of that time, that a true liberal, a true person who could claim freedom and liberty was someone who should have the means for that. If you don't have the means, by definition, you're not free, because you're dependent of those who have the means. So this is why for so long, and very late, even in some places in early 20th century, some form of difference of status between those who have the means to be free, so have the means also to be free for the others, that is to enter government, to enter parliament, and so on and so forth, was so important. And there, that's why the workers' movement played a fantastic role in the end of the 19th century and early 20th in changing that, at least from the point of view of the most elementary structural institutions of our countries.
Thanks so much for the talk. That was really interesting. I guess I wanted to bring, well, actually what you just said pertains to this, but I wanted to bring the end of your talk back to the question of Marx. So this question of what kind of dependency do we want rather than escaping dependency. So I mean, there's the concept of alienation as sort of being alienated from something which is exteriorized in Marx, but there's also the sense of alienation, I think, as dependency. So when he thinks about the division of labor as a Scheidungsprozess, a process of separation, then it's the division of labor which creates a system of all-around social dependency. But the problem there is that so then it's specifically a form of dependency which is mediated by money, because he even says, he says, I think it's in chapter 3, the division of labor is what makes the product of labor a commodity and necessitates its exchange with money, because it's a all-round social dependency that has to be mediated by something other than free giving and receiving, right? So then I guess my question would just be, what do you think of the sort of the Marxist stakes of thinking about dependency from that point of view, where he would also, I think of communism as a situation in which there is dependency, certainly, but it's a form of dependency which is, as it were, doesn't alienate us from our belonging to one another, perhaps, in the way that monetary exchange might.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Obviously, if I spoke about very old, dusty, institutions, it's precisely because I wanted to avoid speaking about Marx, because way better all things Marx than I do. But I would simply say that yes, to your last question, communism was a model of dependency that would oppose its own, let's say, program to the fiction of independence that accompanies liberalism. I would absolutely agree on that. Simply, what I wanted to recall here is that these overtones that are part of the idea of alienation, and especially the use that it has been made these days by this concept as some kind of a war concept, concept that has the nostalgia, it goes with the nostalgia of something. It's perhaps not the best way, to deal with the question. It was simply about, putting that on the table, if I may say so.
I wanted to thank you for the talk again, and I also wanted to just briefly say that you're reframing, so to speak, of alienation as a mode of dependency I found particularly resonated, at least by association, with like the late German Romantics, actually, or the early German Romantics. And I was thinking specifically of Friedrich Hölderlin. I'm very sorry, I do not speak German. Hölderlin. But there is this there's the sense in which he stresses perhaps this proto-Hegelian idea, right? That the alienness of nature is in those parts of it which remind us that we are ourselves a part of it and not its masters, right? And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit further when you say that we should question the state of dependency. What would a sort of ecological framing for that more specifically be? If that's a sufficiently specific question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You are forcing me to get out of the woods because obviously behind that there is a figure that has been very important for me personally and in my career, whatever that is, which is Bruno Latour. Who is Bruno Latour? And Bruno Latour was someone who insisted, obviously, on the question of dependencies and the choice that we can make in that respect, and especially in the context of the environmental crisis, if you like. So he saw some kind of a solution in, what he called the new environmental, the new ecological class that would replace, let's say, the ancient vocabulary of of class struggle. We can discuss that, say if it's okay or not, or his choice, to go for a parliament of things that could reshuffle precisely these bonds or this relationship of dependencies that we have towards whatever, the atmosphere, walls, whatever, in a way that would transform them into actors of the the general system of relationship that we have. These are scenarios, let's say, but communism was also, to some respect, was also a spatial and almost ecological scenario also. So I'd say that the catalogue of possibilities is open and is endless. But speaking of dependency here, for me, was really a nod to the late Bruno.
Thank you, Laurent. Great. I mean, I learn a lot. I'll try to pose a very simple question. What is your take on equality? Because it seems like, but this is very, very, very simplified, but it seems that like the Western world speech on equality is somehow like it's basically claiming that we are all equal, whatever this means, but argument for this is going exclusively to the idea of equality before law. And if we take a look at Hegel's chapter, The State of Legality in the Phenomenology of Spirit, which was referring exactly to the Roman Republic, what he shows there is that if we are like taken exclusively as persons comparing against the law, we get a very dry system of. He says that to call somebody a person is a sign of humiliation. So person is the dried thing lacking content and self-sufficiency. So, and what he also shows that the pure equality before the law gives structural conditions for one to become the master of the world. So this is the question.
Equality, okay. Thank you, Bara. I don't know if I can give also an answer to that question. Perhaps the only thing that I could say here is that what I'm interested in generally when I speak about law is precisely Hegel is right. indeed, a person is nothing. It's a legal function for the transmission of a patrimonium. That's persona, and the legal subject that we fetishize so much as, you know, the bearer of rights and so on and so forth, rights that we even want to give to rivers and trees, you know. It's a legal function. That's all there is. And the idea of indexing values such as equality to these functions, I mean, shouldn't delude us of the fact that it has nothing to do with whatever we feel, sense, and so on and so forth. So it's a tendency that we see in many political circles these days, even radical circles, that, you know, the law will save us to some extent. And the law will save no one, you know, nobody, never. No, it does not. It's not its job. So it's very important to be aware of that, and that's why equality formulated from the point of view of law is and always will be a problem. The feminists were very aware of that very early, you know, very early on, and they still are. The colonial struggle, the same, and so on and so forth. Let's say that if we are to continue speaking about equality, it can only be under the guise of a transcendental on the one hand, or an epistemological tool such as Jacques Rancière's, you know, when you see that if you refuse to look at the world from the point of view of equality, considering the equality of capacity of everyone, then your philosophy isn't worth a dime. So this is kind of a epistemological choice that he makes, that he puts forward. But besides these two oppositions, equality, like, I don't know what, you know, it's kind of myth, and equality as an epistemological tool, yeah, equality is also an empty signifier belonging to the strict bureaucracy of legality.
All right, thank you very much. Laurent, at this point, I see that maybe it's not just the tiredness in me, but also in the external world that is pushing us towards the end of today. Thank you very much, Laurent, for your wonderful presentation.